Hi, everybody. I'm Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program on behalf of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. And today we're celebrating a hero whom Sousa Mendes knew personally quite well, and that is Otto von Habsburg, the last Crown Prince of Austria. We have an illustrious panel here today, but I will only introduce one member of the panel who will be today's moderator, and that is my dear friend, Mr. Felix Pfeifle, who is an architect and a Habsburg scholar who came upon a stack of Habsburg letters that were uh, exchanged between Otto von Habsburg and a friend of his named Herbert Hinckel. And Felix made it his life's work at a certain moment in time to meet Otto von Habsburg, show him these letters, and learn what he could about the history of the Habsburg family. Now, there was a whole film made about Felix's quest, and I highly recommend you all run out and watch it. It's called Felix Austria, and it's available on Amazon and other platforms. So without further ado, my dear friend Felix, how are you today?
Hello, Olivia. Thank you. It's so nice to be here, and thank you for having me. And greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for being here with us today. In rescuing Otto von Habsburg, Aristides de Sousa Mendes saved a man larger than life, who survived to become one of the great statesmen of the European Union. Archduke Franz Joseph Otto of Austria-Hungary was born in 1912 to the Archduke Karl Franz and Archduchess Zita, a princess of Bourbon-Parme. At Otto's birth, his godfather and great-granduncle, Franz Joseph I, was emperor. His granduncle, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir the throne, and his father second in line, placing Otto third. By 1914, with the tragic murder of Franz Ferdinand, and then by 1916, with the death of Franz Joseph, Otto's father ascended the thrones of Austria and Hungary, making Otto heir and crown prince. From these photos, it's easy to imagine how, in the midst of First World War slaughter, the imperial family inspired hope for the empire's future. Just look at that child. Monarchy needs a good face, and in these Habsburgs, it certainly had one for a moment. That moment lasted only 2 years, from 1916 to 1918, when the Habsburgs went into Swiss exile. They were forced by the Allies into deeper exile on the Isle of Madeira, off the coast of Portugal. And by 1922, the emperor, whom we see here at bottom, tragically died of pneumonia at the age of 34, leaving the young Otto at 10 years of age to assume the role as sovereign in exile. We see the Empress at left, now in mourning black, which she wore the rest of her long life, she having died in 1989. This upbringing cannot be underemphasized, as Otto was instructed to believe in his sovereignty, in his duties as well as privileges for most of his childhood, and that it was merely a matter of time that he would be restored to his thrones. That is the pre-World War II historic Otto von Habsburg. But what I want to introduce is another Otto, the Otto I came to know. As a student of Habsburg history, I wanted to discover the ethos of this last heir to Charlemagne, to understand his essence. And it was this: an eternal and exuberant child of the universe, a man of great charm, who was at once regal and humanly humble, a man with a solid, unwavering, and Christian moral compass, a conservative man of great privilege who risked it all to denounce Hitler publicly, and when fleeing from the Nazi war machine, worked to ensure the safety of Jews and other refugees at the border of France. In my filmed conversations with him, with Otto von Habsburg, we can begin to experience these dimensions of Otto, not to be found in an article or a book. He was respectful.
You know, we always have kept the principle, when somebody greets you in the street, you have to greet back. And the letter is like that. You have to answer. So, you know, it's a strange thing, if you see the development, that nowadays few people answer their letters anymore. But it is a simple question of courtesy and respect for somebody who takes the trouble to write to you, that you have to write back.
He was captivating.
Well, I could tell you so many stories, and they are all uninteresting. They are of the past, including some with some supernatural things, prophecy. I'll tell it to you rapidly.
And he was generous.
And did you want something?
Yeah, could we talk
Oh,
about your mother
certainly.
for a minute?
He knew the basics.
But there was apparently in Kansas a gravestone which you particularly liked, and
Yeah.
the epitaph, it said...
It is the
what did it say?
nicest epitaph I've ever read. I will tell you, simply, here lies Joe, he did his darndest. Isn't it marvelous?
And he was anything but a dinosaur.
He had a trial because he had been accused by the editor in an article of being a homosexual. At that time it was still disparaging for somebody to say that he's a homosexual. Today it's the best way to be successful.
Those clips may seem lighthearted, but we might come to understand Otto von Habsburg's fiber. We can come even closer to the person Otto von Habsburg was today by way of his daughter, whom we have here as a guest, a great friend of mine, the Princess MICHAELA von Habsburg. MICHAELA?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to be here and to talk about my father, my idol, that he always was and will always be.
Yes, so tell us, MICHAELA, how was he, what about him, what made him your idol?
He was a magnificent human being. He was a workaholic. He was, for us, always a symbol of what you should do. In our house in Germany, where he was mostly when he wasn't traveling, he was working day and night. He was dictating letters. He answered every letter he always got. And he got up to 250 letters a day, and he would answer every single one of them. Then when we would go out on a walk, he would greet everybody in the street, lift his hat, and said hello to them, if he knew them or not. He was polite. He spoke languages. He really was an idol. But when we were in Benidorm on our summer vacations, or sometimes on our winter vacations, he became Papa. And Papa was like you would really imagine your daddy. And he would go swimming with us and to the beach with us and be just there to answer the thousands of questions we all had, and would be very, very peaceful and playing long things with us. And in the evenings, we would sit around a fireplace or sit around at a table, drinking sherry and having some canapes. And he would start becoming melancholic and started to talk about his youth and the past. And that's when he, of all places, talked about Sousa Mendes. And he talked so many times about him that it became like he was an extra guest at our table, because we asked more or less questions about him, and my father would endlessly answer them. And I had the impression that Sousa Mendes was listening.
What a beautiful memory.
Yes.
As if, Michaela, Sousa Mendes was carried along as a friend within your household as you
Yes,
grew
exactly.
up.
Exactly, yes.
Yes. Well, thank you for some of your reflections. Now I would like to turn to another guest here today with the opposite view of Otto von Habsburg, and that is Hitler's perspective of Otto von Habsburg. Could we see the clip?
Hitler had a plan for Austria
yes.
to invade, which
Yeah.
he called Operation Otto.
Yes.
Why was this?
You see, Hitler was always interested in taking Austria. He hated the Habsburgs from the beginning, because as he wrote in his Mein Kampf, incidentally, that the Habsburgs were friendly with the Jews, friendly with gypsies and so on. You see, because that notion of a multinational empire was something entirely opposite to his idea of blood and race and so on.
In fact, it wasn't just the Habsburgs Hitler hated. It was Otto whom he hated most. With us today is Professor James Longo, author of Hitler and the Habsburgs, a book I found so thrilling that I devoured it in less than a day, truly. Professor Longo, thank you for joining us. Could you please tell us more about the context of Hitler's vendetta against the Habsburgs and against the Archduke Otto?
Thank you, Felix. Thank you very much. Well, here we have this man, Otto von Habsburg, who was a crown prince, who was an archduke, who could talk to kings and ordinary people, became friends with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, people who were strangers on the street. Just a remarkable man that Hitler hated. So why did Hitler hate this man that so many other people admired? And that could be part of it. Hitler called the Habsburg Empire the impossible state. Why was it impossible to him? Because it was tolerant, it was diverse, it was a center of culture, wealth, and upward mobility. An upward mobility Hitler never achieved in Vienna or in Austria. The Habsburg Empire was not perfect, and the Habsburg family was not perfect, and they would be the first to admit it. But they created a government that was tolerant, diverse, multicultural, multinational empire in the middle of Europe. There was nothing like it anywhere else. It became a sanctuary, a refuge for many refugees, ethnic and religious minorities. Jews and Muslims had the same political and religious rights as Catholics and Orthodox Christians. Emperor Franz Joseph declared to his government ministers, "There will be no Jew baiting in my empire." 3 different times, he refused to let the anti-Semitic mayor of Vienna take his office, a man that Hitler admired and loved because of his anti-Semitism. Many Austrian Jews called the Habsburg Emperor guardian angel, their patron saint. Jewish rabbis were welcomed as chaplains in the army, and the emperor welcomed Jews into the Austrian aristocracy, ennobled them and gave them titles. This just did not happen in Europe. As Otto von Habsburg said, Hitler hated the Habsburgs from the beginning, hated them because of their tolerance. Hitler's father, who he detested, admired and respected, and loved the emperor, loved the empire. Hitler hated, of all the Habsburgs, Otto the most. Otto was heir to the throne. He represented everything Hitler hated. It was no accident the invasion of Austria in 1938 was called by Adolf Hitler Operation Otto. It was also no accident that Hitler put out a death warrant for Otto von Habsburg that was on newspapers from one side of Europe to the other. This is a copy right here of the death warrant, the published death warrant, that Hitler wanted Otto von Habsburg dead. In the book Hitler and the Habsburgs, we trace the seeds of Hitler's rise to power to his hatred of the Habsburgs, their multinational vision for a future of Europe, a vision later that Otto helped to achieve through the European Union. The open borders, the religious tolerance, the ethnic diversity, the multicultural, multinational Habsburg Empire represented everything the bigoted, hating, intolerant Adolf Hitler was. In 1909 was a special year for Hitler. He was homeless, he was a vagrant, he was hungry, he was jobless, he was living in a homeless shelter behind the Sonnenbahnhof, the South train station in Vienna. On an opposite hilltop was Belvedere Palace, the home of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination sparked the First World War. Christmas 1909, a hungry, thirsty vagrant, Adolf Hitler, was hired to sweep snow for food in front of the glittering Hotel Imperial. Inside that hotel was a celebration for Karl and Zita Habsburg, heir to the thrones of Austria and Hungary. They were the future parents of Otto. Hitler never forgot that night. He was on the outside looking in. They had everything he wanted and everything he hated. When Hitler invaded Austria in 1938, he had an enemy's list of thousands of names. The first two names on there were the sons of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Why? Why did he hate these two men? There they are. That is Max and Ernst with their wives in 1937. 1 year later, when Hitler invaded Austria, they were the first two Austrians arrested by the Gestapo, imprisoned by the Gestapo, tortured by the Gestapo, and exiled to and sent to Dachau. From this prosperous picture, they became prisoners, tortured at Dachau. They were the men who were trying to restore the Habsburg Empire to the throne. They were the men who were trying to see that Crown Prince Otto became Emperor of Austria, and Hitler hated them for it. The Habsburgs' worst nightmare was an apocalyptic race war. That's what Hitler wanted. Hitler wanted a war that would destroy the minorities across Europe. The Habsburgs wanted peace. Hitler wanted war. Hitler was the ultimate outsider. He was a school dropout, a failed artist. He collected people around him that he could use and then discard. Some of the people he collected was the Prussian royal family. The Crown Prince of Prussia became a supporter of Hitler, publicly said he was going to vote for Hitler in the next open election. His brothers did the same. Hitler collected royalty because he felt it legitimatized them. Another person he collected was the Duke of Windsor and the Duchess of Windsor. The former King Edward VIII of England was photographed visiting Hitler. Hitler loved it. Hitler loved it. What Hitler was not able to do was ever meet Otto von Habsburg, who refused to meet him two different times. Otto von Habsburg did not meet Sousa Mendes until later, but they were two kindred spirits, two men who were courageous, who did the right when so many others didn't, who opened their eyes and their hearts to refugees. Otto von Habsburg fled Belgium to go to Paris, and then later went to Bordeaux, where he met Sousa Mendes. But why did Otto, who was a refugee, stop in Paris. He stopped to help other refugees. These were men who cared about outcasts, who cared about the rejected. It's not a surprise that these two remarkable men hooked up and became very, very special allies and friends. Felix?
Thank you so much, James. Really, I don't think that many people are aware of the monumental stand that Otto von Habsburg took against the Nazis and what that represents vis-a-vis his own peers at that time. And the fact, and you lay that forth so well, thank you. And the very fact that he put his own life in danger by doing that. Not only, I should say, he didn't put his own life in danger, he put the lives of his brothers and his mother in danger, because there were orders to shoot to kill the Empress Zita, Otto's mother, and also Otto and his brothers on sight. They effectively had been outlawed out of the Reich. And I should also add that there was an article that Otto von Habsburg published in a French newspaper that I believe was in reality the final straw of Hitler's hatred. Not merely had Hitler been snubbed by the Habsburgs, and you can imagine the symbolism of that, and James, you draw upon that, but it was also this article in which, published in French, in which Otto roundly denounced Nazi radicalism. But in any case, in France, with Hitler's hatred for the Habsburgs abundantly manifest, and Otto fleeing for his life, actually from Belgium, because the Habsburgs had been living in a castle there provided to them by friends, and they fled Belgium into France. There, Otto and his brothers organized, as James mentioned, with government officials and leaders from other falling or fallen countries to accommodate the mass exodus descending upon and through France. Could we see the clip about Daladier?
For security reasons, then when Daladier was prime minister, I had several talks with Mr. Daladier about the subject, and that is when we arranged for the creation of 3 zones of security. One zone of security was Libourne, that was for the Poles. The other one was Agen for the Czechs, and there was Lectoure for the Austrians. So that these 3 districts where people could rally, find some lodging, find some help, where we could establish the organizations in case, which I never believed would come, that the French would collapse. And of course, then it started functioning when the French situation became bad.
Amid this chaos, one of the most memorable stories Otto von Habsburg ever told me was of the night before Paris fell, when he was invited to dine at the Ritz with Claire Booth Luce, a legend in her own right and wife of the publisher of Time Life.
The last contact I had with the Americans was the day before Paris fell. It was an interesting evening. I was in Paris, and Claire Booth Luce came through Paris en route to Switzerland. And Claire Booth Luce was staying at the Ritz and was there, and I was in contact with her. And so she invited me to come and dine with her at the Ritz on that evening. It was the last evening in Paris. It was one of the extraordinary moments. I had my brother Karl Ludwig and myself, and it was that night when the government had already fled, when Paris was half a dead city, half a fleeing city. And I had decided I wouldn't leave before I wasn't sure that all my groups would be safe. So that was quite a big thing, but it had to be done.
That the Archduke is talking about a moment in his life when he was 27 years old, So by today's standards, practically a late adolescent, sorry, 20 somethings, but he had a very large sense of responsibility for the people around him. In any case, from Paris, the Habsburgs were among the estimated 8 million persons who were fleeing across France, from across Europe and from across the nation. In France, the period is called l'exode, the Exodus, and the scope of its apocalyptic suffering is deeply personal to many people in our audience today. We see images of entire towns fleeing. The Exodus include every layer of European society, from villagers to government leaders, from famous philosophers and artists to the Rothschilds and scores of royals. The rallying point for the great mass of these refugees was Bordeaux, where Sousa Mendes was mobilizing as Consul General of Portugal to defy his government's orders by issuing visas to all, religion and politics aside. Famously, as many here know, Sousa Mendes expressed, "I am going to issue a visa to anyone who asks for it. Even if I am discharged, I can only act as a Christian, as my conscience tells me. I would rather stand with God against man than with man against God." The Archduke, already having helped organize refugees to reach Bordeaux, continued his push to help others by contacting Sousa Mendes, understanding him to be the most important man in Bordeaux at the time, really.
Of course, de Sousa Mendes was thinking of helping them, but I had a little role in sort of contacting him.
Sousa Mendes was a hero, and he was persecuted for his actions and died in poverty, thanks to the fascist government of Portugal. In a touching letter to the grandson of Sousa Mendes, Otto von Habsburg wrote, "During a period in which many were cowards, Sousa Mendes was a veritable hero of the West. May you be proud of your grandfather." Excuse me, I get very emotional when I think about, especially Sousa Mendes and everything that was transpiring at that time, and what the actions of men like Sousa Mendes and Otto von Habsburg means to us. I want to emphasize that had Otto von Habsburg and his family not received their visas, their lives would surely have ended. They would surely have been caught and murdered by the Nazis. Michaela,
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little more about your reflections on your father and his esteem for Sousa Mendes, and in terms of like perhaps some of the commonalities of moral rectitude between the men, and what it meant for you growing up?
Well, the first time we heard about Sousa Mendes was in Benidorm at one of those evenings that we were all sitting together and asking my father about the war and what happened. And he was and he was telling us about how he came to Bordeaux with his mother and his brothers, and how he met Sousa Mendes, the both men having the same idea to get as many people away from Hitler and away from the concentration camps as they could, and to just give them out as many visas as possible to help them. And it was hard enough for these poor people to get out, but then once they got to Bordeaux, at least to get to something and get a visa. And many of these people then also came to America, of course, and or other places in Europe. And these were many, many talks at night when we had them. And every time we talked about these subjects, my father told us that he really, and it's not very godly to hate anybody, but if there was one person in this world he hated, it was Hitler. And he made it very, very clear.
Thank you. And I especially enjoy the image, and I hope others may take this away with them from this call, this Zoom presentation, the idea of, because we can see what a jovial character Sousa Mendes was too, I can envisage him being a guest at your dinners at home, an imaginary sort of legendary spirit at the dinner table as you grew up. Well, after the devastation of the Second World War, Otto set his sights on helping Europe to unite. This is what Sousa Mendes also helped by way of saving the life of the Archduke Otto von Habsburg. Otto von Habsburg renounced his rights to the thrones of Austria and Hungary, and he became an elected member of the European Parliament from 1979 to 1999, retiring
69.
as a senior, sorry.
It was in 69
Oh,
that
in
he resigned.
69.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And well, when he retired, he was its senior member. At Parliament, Habsburg was tireless in standing up for the forgotten half of Europe, the East Bloc. Again, sort of standing up for the downtrodden, so to speak, having been in a similar position himself, having been exiled from Europe. When few had the courage to take a stand for these Soviet-oppressed states, namely the eastern half of Europe, Otto von Habsburg insisted that chairs in the House of Parliament in Belgium be kept open for their future representatives at the European Union. And that gesture of solidarity went a long way to the encouragement of those peoples behind the Iron Curtain. As Soviet Europe crumbled in 1989, Habsburg organized a so-called picnic with the Prime Minister of Hungary to open the border to Austria, allowing hundreds of refugees to surge into the West. From that point forward, Habsburg was a pivotal figure in the integration of former East Bloc countries into the European Union. We saw evidence of that when a cake was presented to Otto von Habsburg as Mr. Europa, Mr. Europe. With that, I would like to hand the floor back to Olivia.
Thank you, Felix. Boy, what a fascinating discussion. I would like to encourage the audience to continue putting questions into the chat box. There are already some questions in there, but there'll be plenty of time for some very vigorous discussion. So please do put your questions into the chat box. I'm just briefly taking the floor back right now to tell you about our program next week. Next week, we are focusing on the German anti-Nazi student resistance group, this amazing group who called themselves the White Rose. And there was a brother and sister team at the heart of this group, and that was Hans and Sophie Scholl. So we are presenting their remarkable story next week. There's a very, very moving film. And following the film, you will meet the expert who is in the film, Dr. Judd Newborn, who is the world's expert on the White Rose, and he wrote a book about them and focusing on Sophie Scholl. So most of our programs, as you know, are free. Next week, we do require tickets. So tickets are donation of any amount. We do request $18 representing life or high. It also is your final opportunity to get a season ticket for the whole year if you like what we do and you want to not worry about having to register and remember deadlines and having donations requested along the way. Here's your chance to get a season ticket for the entire year. And those who have season tickets will tell you that it's very convenient. And so I do encourage you. And of course, let us know if you have any questions about that. And if you have made donations recently, we can count those toward the price of the season ticket. So do please contact us and we will let you know how much it would cost for the year. And on top of all of that, we actually do have a sponsor for next week. So for anyone in our audience for whom cost is a factor, you can simply request a sponsored ticket by sending us an email to info@sousamendesfoundation.org with the subject line Sophie. So again, if you would like a sponsored ticket, simply send us an email with the subject line Sophie. And next week's program is one that's not to be missed, and so you have absolutely no excuse. We hope and expect to see you all next week. We also have fabulous programs for the rest of, well, for February and into March, all the way up to March 20th, and then we'll take a break for a few weeks until after Passover. But so there are some wonderful programs coming up. I do encourage you to look at our website under events. So it's sousamendesfoundation.org/events, and you'll see all of our upcoming programs. So now let's turn to some of your questions. So this question is for Felix. When were the Otto interviews done?
Hello. They were done September 5th, 2005. That was Labor Day in America, but quite a while ago at this point. And I'm sorry, I had several more such exchanges with Otto von Habsburg, also in Sarajevo and Vienna. But what we just saw today was 2005 at the Villa Austria, his house. And yeah, 2005.
Okay, so some more questions. So was Otto von Habsburg regretful of the life he could have led?
Michaela, I think that question's for you.
Yes, I think so. No, he was not. He was absolutely 100% a politician. He said always, as an emperor or as a king, I can be the leader of one country. As a European, I can be a leader of many countries. He was the consummate politician. He wrote more books. He made more speeches. He traveled all over the United States. He had the freedom that he would have never had if he would have been an emperor or a king.
Okay, now there's a question about other royal families in other cities in Europe. So were they all so liberal and pro-democratic as Otto von Habsburg was, or were there others who had their sympathies on the other side of the spectrum?
Yeah. Go ahead, Michaela.
No, I think that not all of them were quite as liberal and as democratic as my father was, but some liked to be at home at their castles, going to their hunts, and don't get involved in politics. And others joined my father and also went for politics. But Felix, maybe you know more about that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point Michaela makes. When others may have gone to resorts like Marbella or gone for their hunt. Otto von Habsburg once said to me, they do not know what the task at hand is. I think that explains, for him, there was always a political and human task at hand, and he was very likely to be there for it. And his actions and his record show that. I will say, though, I think to answer another part of that question, there were a number of royal families or former royal families, families of the higher aristocracy who came in on both sides, who were part of the resistance against the Nazis, and others who were enthusiastically Nazi and fascist. The parts of the Hohenzollern ruling family of Prussia were pretty enthusiastic Nazis. Same with the royal family of Hessen. Not everyone in those families. The Duke of Windsor was very friendly with the Nazis, just to give you an idea. Others were not. The Luxembourg royal family, the Belgian royal family, the Norwegian and Scandinavian royal families were very anti-Nazi and anti-fascist.
Can somebody talk a little bit more about the two occasions when Hitler demanded to see Otto von Habsburg, but Otto refused? That is so fascinating, and we want to know more about that.
James, I'll give the floor to you on that one.
Thank you, Felix. Well, Otto was studying for his doctorate, and he was unable to go to Austria. He would not be allowed to Austria to do his research. So he went to Berlin. And when he was in Berlin, studying for his doctorate, he met most of the leading politicians in Germany. And at one point, a member of the Prussian royal family, he met him about meeting Hitler. But Empress Zita said to her son, to Otto, that he should give courtesy to the Prussian royal family by being sure to speak with them when he was in Berlin. And so he made a point of doing that. But when he went to meet August Wilhelm, who was a younger brother of the Crown Prince, August Wilhelm, who was a Nazi, met him in a uniform, in a Nazi uniform, which Otto was horrified at, that a member of the royal family was embracing this Nazi ideology, this anti-Semitism, this hatred. And August Wilhelm said to Otto that the Fuhrer wanted to meet him. And Otto said, well, I'm here as a student. I'm not here on for political reasons. I'm just doing my research, and I don't want to get involved with politics. Well, of course, the joke was he had been meeting with every politician he could in the Reichstag and in Germany. So he refused. Then Hermann Goering, who was the #2 Nazi under Hitler and in Germany, he contacted Otto, I believe, and said that the Fuhrer really wanted to meet him. And Otto refused for a second time. And not a lot of people refused Hermann Goering. So Hitler really felt rebuffed and angry about that. And you did mention the Duke of Windsor. The Duke of Windsor really was enamored with the Nazis. And when he was the Prince of Wales, he commented that there were a lot of dictatorships across Europe, and he thought England might need one pretty soon. The King of England, King Edward VIII, really frightened people because he was, underneath his crown as Prince and King, he was very much a Nazi.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I also want to add, at this time, and I think this point is very interesting, Otto von Habsburg was not particularly liberal, so to speak. I think what we're talking about is the dividing line between the humane treatment of other people and the inhumane treatment. What we know is that he was, forgive the pun, but, or no pun intended, shall I say, arch conservative. You know, the Habsburgs coming out of the empire were not known for being highly liberal. There were liberal elements to the policies of the Emperor Karl. And also, I think that Otto von Habsburg pretty clearly stood for a democratic representational government. But within that context, he was not liberal. He just had basic and decent humanitarian notions. And I think that that is noteworthy in the scope of like the wider context of European politics at that time.
I want to focus us on something that's already been discussed, and that is the post-World War II role of Otto von Habsburg in establishing the new Europe in the following the ashes of the Holocaust. His role in that, and therefore Sousa Mendes's role in the new post-war Europe. So I would like our panel to speak more about what is it exactly that Otto did to create this new Europe? What were his major achievements?
Yes, I think that as a member of, before becoming a member of the European Parliament, he was the president of the Pan-European Union, Pan-Europa Union. The Pan-European Union, which still exists today, was a specifically conservative, Christian-based union for the to support the unification of Europe, which of course came to pass. His son, I believe, Karl, his heir, is now perhaps honorary president or president of that organization. So he was active with, I mean, the thing about Otto von Habsburg people also need to understand is we can see how gregarious he is and how connective he is. So he was a major connector across the planet. He was very closely tied to Churchill and President Roosevelt during the war, but then after the war, to all the leaders across Europe in general, who were involved in the development of the European Union. And then I will note his special focus, obviously, is being that liaison between the East and the West. I think some people here are old enough to know, I was born at the end of the 1960s, and I still remember thinking of Eastern Europe as being some forlorn, other exotic place. And it was treated that way as well by Western European politicians. There's a question in the audience, by the way, by Sue Wohlmans. I'm sorry, I'm pronouncing it in the German. Sue Wohlmans is an accomplished author about history and royalty. And she asked a question, I'm going to answer it now by way of context of this. She asked what recognition Otto von Habsburg had among Europeans and among his own peers, other politicians in Europe, because she asked, or rather put forth, he is unknown in England. Well, I think her comment, with all due respect, says a lot about Great Britain and England and the Western perspective on East European countries. They're not in the vizier, you know, they're not, they definitely take a sort of tertiary role in the vision of countries like France, Germany, and England. So Otto von Habsburg may not be known to many English people. On the continent, however, and in the context of Central European politics, he was a major broker in bringing the powers that be at the European Union, obviously those countries from the West, the leaders from the West, with the developing nations like Croatia, Bosnia, where I met him and he spoke in front of Parliament, even Kosovo. He was doing what he could to bring them into the family of European nations. Lithuania honored him very highly, I think with an honorary citizenship. So he was celebrated when he died by all those countries. Again, not so well known in the Anglo-Saxon world, which would kind of include America.
Princess Michaela, may I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
What was your father's attitude to the European Union? He was such an important part of it, and he was so respected in it. What did he share about that vision of the European Union with the family?
Well, it was originally, together with the Count Coudenhove-Kalergi, his idea, this European Union. And he was one of the brokers of the European Union. And he was for 40 years, I think, a member of the European Union. He, as an Austrian citizen or as an Austrian foreign citizen, because we didn't have Austrian passports for a while, became a member of the German party. He never had a German passport, but he became a party member of the European Parliament from the Germans. And the European Parliament, we were breathing and living because he was spending all his weeks in the Parliament, in Brussels, in Strasbourg, or wherever they were meeting, and spent the entire week there and would only come back for the weekends. And he was at every time they were voting for something, he was there. He was not only a paid participant who only signed in and left, he was there for all the sessions, may they be small or big. He was 100% convinced of it.
I wonder what we can learn from Otto von Habsburg in our own lives today. So we're 5 minutes before the end of the program. I'd like to turn to final thoughts of our speakers. Perhaps Princess Michaela, you can tell us what you feel are his lessons for us today.
His lessons is not to fight, to unite. He loved to unite people. He enjoyed the United States because during his time, the United States still were a more united way, not like now that they are unfortunately breaking apart, but it was united. And Europe also is now a united Europe. And I'm sure he would have been very upset about the English behavior of leaving the European Parliament. But I can tell you, I loved him with all my heart. I admired him, and I will miss him till my dying days.
What an honor for us to have you among us today, Princess Michaela.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Professor Longo, what would you like to say to our audience?
Well, there's so much to say. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand visited the United States and was fascinated with the federal union here and took it back to Europe. Emperor Karl was fascinated with that. At the end of the war, he tried to do a federation of states to save the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then Otto took that idea and went with it, and we have the European Union, in large part because of people like Otto. Archduke Franz Ferdinand's youngest son, Prince Gernhard, once said to me, what we needed in those days when Hitler was there was we needed people of courage, but there were few people who had courage. Sousa Mendes did, Otto von Habsburg did, and the reality is we need that now. We need people of courage who go beyond small sign and don't look for the differences in people, but what unites us. And that was one of the great strengths of the Habsburgs. It was one of the great strengths of Otto. We need a Sousa Mendes. We need an Otto von Habsburg. But the reality is we need to be those people. We need to take that up and do the right thing today. We need heroes today. We need courage. And these men showed us the way.
Now, Felix, isn't there some sort of an effort to have Otto von Habsburg honored at Yad Vashem?
My understanding is yes, that Otto von Habsburg is a candidate for status of righteous among the nations for having saved the lives of Jews during the Holocaust. That would be June 1940, as he was escaping. I am unaware of the status of it, and I would very much appreciate, and I know that the family would as well, to hear from anyone who has direct knowledge of having been rescued by Otto von Habsburg and or his brothers. It's a little difficult to pinpoint because in reality, Otto and his brothers were organizing these people, probably thousands, to get to Sousa Mendes. So there may not be any paperwork there. If anyone has direct knowledge of having been organized by a Habsburg, by Otto von Habsburg, I would be glad to hear from that person. If that answers your question.
Yes.
And then is there anything more you want to add for your own final thoughts?
Thank you. Well, I want to thank James and Michaela so much for this wonderful opportunity. It's been a rich way of a rich exchange, and also leading up to this. Olivia, thank you. And I want to I think back up, add to what James Longo said. We need right now, right here in the United States, we need the men and women of the character of Otto von Habsburg and Sousa Mendes. We see so much strife and so much division. We need someone who can stand outside partisan strife and just be a good human. And I sense also the Ukraine right now is going to need people like Otto von Habsburg and Sousa Mendes. So they are their legacy is relevant to us right now. So I would say silence is violence too. I'll just leave you with that. Silence is violence. All right, thank you, Olivia.
Thank you to my brilliant speakers today and to our wonderful loyal audience that comes week after week. I expect to see you all next week, and I wish you the most wonderful of days.